Hello and welcome. My name's Justin Woods, and I'm one of the co-hosts from the Talking Roadmaps channel, the YouTube channel and podcast where we talk about everything roadmaps, from the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have expert practitioners like Michael, who I'm going to introduce shortly. We have special guests. We also talk about tools and top tips as well. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Michael Morris onto the channel. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Justin. It's great to be here.
It's great for you to be here as well, because of course we've got a bit of history. We've worked together in the past through road mapping, and actually, Michael, you've had a really rich and experience of product management throughout your career, and different bits around software development as well. I was wondering if you could just share with us some of your history and your experience.
I've been in product probably for the last 15 years in either as a practitioner or leading product teams. Prior to that, probably the standard, almost the Silicon Valley classic, software engineering background, but never destined to be a developer really, with a computer science degree. But spent early part of my career in consulting and implementation professional services, always in the sort of B2B software space, and was probably fascinated quite early, I guess, with the intersection of business and technology, and that sort of led me almost accidentally into product. But yeah, spent a lot of time between Australia and now the UK, with global businesses, doing B2B software product work. It's been great.
Superb. Yeah, I wonder if that's one of the reasons why I just managed to gel with you quite a lot early on. My former background at IBM and as a software developer, and a background in computer engineering as well. You said it quite right. There's that intersection between technology and the business that I think is a big attraction for people getting into product management. That's the place that we meet.
I knew enough on the technology side to communicate with the engineers, but picked up enough from the sort of consulting angle and professional service angle to talk to customers and to think through the business model and all that sort of stuff. And so being able to play both sides of that coin, I guess, is valuable.
It is, yeah, absolutely. And of course, you've held some senior roles in product at Experian and now head of product at TrueLayer for the last 7 months. So congratulations with that.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great. I spent a lot of time with Experian, which is a great company. Really formative part of my career, and had some really great opportunities for which I'll ever be thankful. But yeah, about 6-7 months ago, moved to fintech in London, who sort of have a pretty good presence across Europe as well, called TrueLayer. So maybe I'll talk a bit more about that later on.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. We can switch up or talk back around any of these questions as we go. In fact, sometimes we come full circle. As always with the YouTube channel, please do like and subscribe if you find value in this. It helps us for other people to find us on the channel. And by all means, share us out as well. If Michael or I mention something that's interesting to you, share it out to someone that you think would find value. Also, if you'd like to get in touch and sit where Michael is today, then feel free just to reach out, get in contact with our email address or comment down below, and we'd love to have you on the channel. Cool. So maybe I'll kick things off with kind of a really direct question here, which is, in terms of a roadmap, what in your experience has been the purpose of a roadmap?
The purpose is ultimately to communicate, right? And I think for me, it's to communicate the product plan as currently constituted. And I use the term product plan fairly deliberately. We talk about the plan, and plans can change, right? We talk about our intention, and even if the roadmap is the artifact by which we use to communicate, really try and frame the roadmap as the product plan, or here's the sequence of items that solve certain problems, to work towards our sort of broader vision. Here's the steps we're going to take along that journey, and I think that's what a roadmap should be.
I really like that definition of it. It's a sequence of problems. In fact, I've hashed it up already, but it was a sequence that you mentioned of outcomes or problems that are going to get us to where we need to be. And I think sometimes people go far too deep into a delivery plan and what they think that needs to look like. But actually, that's really elegant. It's just here is a sequence of things that we're considering that are going to help us to achieve that. That's a great way of putting it.
If you think, if we go theoretical and think about, what a roadmap is, right? Is I want to get from point A to point B, and I'm going to look at, maybe the various stops I'm going to take along the way, or the route I'm going to take to get there, and so, a product roadmap is the articulation of that from a product plan perspective, which is why I think that product plan element is really important.
Love that definition of kind of the purpose of a roadmap. From your experience, who has been the audience of a roadmap?
I mean, does everyone class as a category? I think, there's certainly more than one audience. That's for sure, and different groups need different things. And some of those groups, particularly when we think about internal, right? I think we can maybe say, hey, there's internal and external audiences. I think many of the internal audiences to our organizations, they actually want to use the roadmap and convey different things to their own audiences, right? If you think about from a sales perspective and a go-to-market perspective, it's like, what can I sell now and what can I sell later? But actually, they want to be able to share that information with clients to get them excited and to galvanize opportunities they're already working on. They always, are interested in, like, of course, what's changing, because that impacts things like sales cycle. You've got other product teams, right? Is a really important audience. So, when we think about some of the work we did previously together, the initial audience for that was an internal product and engineering audience, right? It's like, how do we map this stuff out to identify what dependencies might exist much more clearly, and then that forces a conversation, or it forces a set of actions. And by extension, I think that forcing the conversation is true of all internal departments, right? It could be implementation and professional services, and others. I think what's general across those internal groups is they want some view of what's coming from a product perspective, why it's coming, like why those decisions being made, ideally when they're coming, right? Which is the sort of maybe the big sticking point always with roadmaps. And that might trigger a whole bunch of actions or other conversations depending on the department. If we think about the external audiences, customers, investors, and actually each of those, particularly I think when you transition from internal to external, the nature of the content, and the message is being conveyed as part of that communication, I think changes fairly dramatically.
That's really true. And actually, there's two bits you mentioned there that I thought were really valuable and possibly hadn't brought out on previous episodes, which is the point that sometimes the product roadmap that you create can be for other product teams. That's really important. It's not just one product team. It's here are the cross dependencies that we're working on. Here are the timelines. So actually, sometimes they're going to need visibility of your roadmap and your overall trajectory with which they may align to, but they're also going to need visibility of the delivery plan so that they can align their delivery and coordinate with that. And the second piece that you picked up was around the investors. And I think that's a really important thing that we may not have touched on before as well, which is that the investors are potentially going to want to see a roadmap, not in terms of a delivery plan, but what's the overall strategic direction of the company, because they want to know what direction you're going in.
The lens varies, right? I think it's, if we're talking about other delivery teams or other product teams, we are getting more to that project type perspective on things. We're trying to use that as do we have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed between these two teams, because dependencies just always exist. At the investor level, even the customer level, we're just coming up, that sort of 30,000 foot level, right? We're just providing a different lens, different level of detail, I think.
You mentioned at the beginning that the roadmap is a communication tool. It needs to communicate to that target audience. So yeah, that makes sense. What about ownership of the roadmap? Who do you think owns a roadmap within an organization?
I mean, for me, it sort of depends on what we mean when we say own, right? What is it that's being owned? Like the product decisions and the rationale that become the inputs into the roadmap content, is owned by the product manager, right, and the product management team, and that sort of organization. But like the artifact of the roadmap and the process that goes along with the curation of it and keeping up to date and sharing it, communicating it, I think that can vary. And for me, that I think that point's really important. If we expect the roadmap to be just this thing, this digital or on paper artifact that is self-explanatory, I think we're probably kidding ourselves. So like ownership of the process that surrounds its creation and the cadence of its communication. I truly believe that if we're going to create a roadmap, particularly for an internal audience or set of audiences, it needs to be presented on a regular basis. And so if we think about that process, who owns that can vary, right? It can be product management. I've had really good success in the past with that being owned by product marketing. Maybe it's product operations if that's a thing in your organization. So, but having clarity on ownership is critical. But really thinking about it as an entire process as opposed to just like the artifact, for me is really important.
That's a great answer, actually, and so vital. It's not a single page in a PowerPoint or whatever tool you're using. It is a process, and there needs to be ownership of the inputs. But I like your differentiation of that as well. That's great, and maybe that bleeds into the question of around who maintains a roadmap then, because I think we've already summarized part of that. That could be a product operations or a product marketing team. That is going to own the overall maintenance of the roadmap, but the inputs could come from somewhere else.
Yeah, and I think come back to those inputs are essentially the product decisions, right? It's a representation of the product plan as we've currently defined it, and so like those decisions are being made by product management, and how those decisions are made, is maybe a topic for a different discussion. But we just say the product manager is the person who's making that decision that item is going to be on the roadmap. But more broadly, I guess I think that question of maintenance is tricky, and I think the question actually at the heart of maintenance is what happens when things change. Right. What happens when something on the roadmap isn't the same as it was when you presented it to me a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago? And so if we assume that we have a nice quarterly rhythm, the artifact is produced through whatever process owned by whichever department, and it gets presented on a regular basis, okay, that's really great. In that same cadence, when we present the roadmap, I think it's certainly the right thing to do to share when things have moved and when things have changed. However, each product or initiative will have different key stakeholders. And if the first time those stakeholders are hearing about the change of something on the roadmap, then something's probably gone wrong there. And let's be clear, when things change, they usually shift to the right rather than things happening earlier. So I think that is a tricky one. I would say that when things change, it's certainly the responsibility of the product manager to make sure that key people are informed, as soon as possible, with the right information. As a catch-all, right, if we have a good cadence of updating the artifact and presenting it, we can bring the sort of general population or those other audiences up to speed as part of that process. And I think that's probably okay.
That's the difference, I think, between the roadmap being a communication tool and the roadmap being an alignment tool, because what I think we're saying there is sometimes someone will spot something's changed on the roadmap, and it's through the viewing of that roadmap that they see the change. Whereas actually what you're sharing here, I think, is that as part of a process, they should have been informed already, and then therefore the delivery or view of that roadmap is actually the alignment or acknowledgement of that change. Sometimes a change in the roadmap, it's just not just the visual that tells them the change, it's clarification of what was already discussed. And I think there's a level of etiquette in there, isn't there?
It's sort of the no surprises thing, right? Like particularly depending if there's an executive sponsor on a given product or initiative, and something doesn't work, as a partner dependency that doesn't quite happen the month you want it to happen and it's delayed by a month, like that executive sponsor needs to know at the time that thing is happening, and what mitigation we have in place, or what the potential flow and impact is, or those things can't wait for your next quarterly update.
Totally agree. And potentially a bit more down at the project or delivery plan level, which we kind of want to keep separate from the main sort of strategic roadmap.
Definitely. I think you see those items shift. I mean, if there's a big enough material movement in an item that you said, hey, it's going to be done at the end of Q2 and now it's the end of Q3, like that's a visible shift and should be called out, right? But yeah, I think there's a difference, like you said, between the project delivery view of the world and, hey, here was our intention and our product plan.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned some other things around, we've talked about delivery plan and project plans, thinking more upstream of the roadmap, potentially the vision, the strategy, and the objectives. What do you see as the relationship between a roadmap and kind of those higher level North Star type documents?
The product roadmap is at the bottom of that stack. Those things you mentioned, if we think about vision or strategy or goals or strategic priorities, or pick your vernacular, they provide the direction of travel. They provide the guardrails, if you like, for the roadmap. They provide the maybe even in some cases key points upon which product decisions ultimately get made, right? But those things act as the filter, if you like, for what ends up on the roadmap. So the roadmap represents the more discrete set of product decisions of what problems to tackle and possibly how we tackle them, and the order in which we'll sequence those to make progress toward that vision. But if you don't have the vision, or you don't have the strategic priorities or some of those guardrails, then the roadmap can have anything on it, can't it? I mean, and anything, and it's okay. It's the output, right? It's the output of those higher order artifacts or sets of processes.
Yeah, agreed. And I've seen situations where companies have a roadmap, but they don't have clarity in those strategic vision, objectives, etc. And so the roadmap is it's a trajectory, where we are now to the trajectory we're going. But where are we going? The whole point of the strategy, the vision, the objectives, the North Star is it sets the North Star to where we're going. And so a roadmap is going to show direction. A roadmap is going to show velocity, but not necessarily any form of direction. And I think that's that's a really dangerous position to be in.
One of the things that for me is really important. And it's why I say, when I think, if you take an internal audience and we say we have a roadmap, I believe it should be presented, because I think what's really critical there is context, right? The context for the roadmap, the context for the plan, is not inherently on a single slide that's got a bunch of text on it type scenario, right? So understanding those. The context through strategy, through vision, etc., is the path to a successful product roadmap artifact.
I love that wording there. It's the context. That's so important. Anything without context is we should question that, whereas that sets all of the framing that we need. That's a great answer. Thank you for that. I wonder if we go into kind of the design then. So we've talked about kind of the core of a roadmap and what purpose it serves. From your experience, what do you believe are some of the key elements or the content of a roadmap? What do you like to see on that roadmap?
Maybe I'll start with what I don't like to see. Maybe it's a reaction, or it's just this sort of innate desire to show people all the stuff we're working on. Here's all the good stuff. Here's product manager wants to demonstrate that their product team, the engineering team, is really busy doing stuff, and so you end up with a roadmap that's got loads and loads of stuff on it, right? If we talk about roadmap as like being some visual representation, which I think we'll talk about, but firstly, I don't think it has everything on it, right? I think a good roadmap doesn't have everything on it. It has the most important things. And one of the things that I found useful is, again, coming back to maybe the idea of context is, okay, you got the roadmap, which people probably have some sort of visual representation in their head. It's got some time frames on it. It's got some boxes on a screen with items. I think, and that's fine. But actually, to say to an internal audience, okay, here's this view, and here's like the most important things. But actually, of the most important things, there's actually something that's even more important, right? And so, pulling the key headlines of that out into things that we've called in the past, maybe like a spotlight, right? So I've got, hey, there's 5 items across this roadmap and this particular work stream, but in the next quarter or two, like here's the spotlight. If you're going to take away something, Mr. Salesperson, like here's the thing you should take away. And so separating those key headline items from the the roadmap sort of Gantt view of the world, if you like, and saying, here's a key highlight. Here's what you should really pay attention to. Here's the customer need. Here's the elevator pitch that you can see. Here's the key benefits. Here are some of the key features. Beyond just looking at that sequential view, I think it's also something that goes into a good roadmap. So, I don't think about a roadmap being just that sequential view. I think you can enrich that roadmap by saying, okay, now we're going to do a spotlight on these one or two sort of headline items, which I found to be really useful. In communicating to the audience what it is you're trying to accomplish.
Right. And that completely really well feeds into what you're talking about was the lens, which is thinking about your target audience. What do they want to know? And spotlighting that for them. That really resonates with me. What about some of the anti-patterns or bad practices you may regularly encounter? I think we joked at one earlier on, which was kind of things always sliding to the right as a typical anti-pattern for things. But are there any others that come to mind, some kind of anti-patterns or bad practices that you've seen in road mapping?
Treating it like more of a project plan, where if you think about, you've got these quarterly horizons, and maybe we could talk about what I think about that, but like you got these quarterly horizons, and you've got a bar that says going to deliver this widget, trying to make that look like the length of time that it's taking to do the work, right? Or linking dependencies between that item on the roadmap and another item. I mean, I think that's an anti-pattern, right? I think you're in the world of project management and dependency mapping and a whole bunch of other stuff. You're asking the roadmap to do too much.
I read somewhere the other day, someone was saying that they're tired of the sales team getting a ruler out and measuring the length of their boxes. I just thought it was hilarious. But you mentioned a couple there in terms of how the horizons. I'd love to go into that a little bit more in terms of, do you have a preferred way to visualize and style for a roadmap? And it sounds like horizons may be part of that for you.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that word is too too fluffy. For me, I think what I've found to work over the years is next quarter, right? Really clear next quarter, the quarter after that, and then actually maybe we're looking at half, right? So, and you could even think about the visualization. I've got Q1, I've got Q2, I've got H2, and then maybe I've got like a future column, right? This is in discovery, or this is stuff that's in the labs, or whatever. But when I say horizon, I just think what are those key blocks of time? Monthly's wrong, because I just don't think things work that way, and actually visually that becomes really challenging. But yeah, a quarterly or with a half here or there, I think is probably the way to think about it. The presentation beyond the time frame is also really interesting. So, if you're a one product organization, like it's pretty straightforward, right? I can take a one product view. Maybe if I think I've got some sort of swim lane element to this roadmap, I can think about layers of technology, right? Depending on how you're organized. If you're a multi-product organization, right, you've exponentially complicated the consumption of that information, right, to the audience. So picking the way you present that information, be it by, like I said, maybe it's technology layer, maybe it's use case, maybe it's strategic priority, right? I think, again, if you go to context, couching the roadmap in the strategic priorities is a really useful thing to do, because that helps you cut through some of the, well, why are we even doing this, right? If you couch it up front in those whatever those key themes are. So for me, there's no hard or fast on that. I think you really got to look at again what your audience is looking to get out of it, or what you're looking to get to them, and then picking a model that works from a thematic perspective. I do think those themes are important, because when you think about elevating through the levels of roadmap, if I want to come up to present to my investors, let's say, or my board or my executive, maybe I'm just presenting the themes, right? And then some key initiatives for the theme, right, and the impact of that. So, but you need something. You need some sort of thematic overview as you look to present. The other thing that has been useful over time is to think about tags. And so we talk about tags, we think about things like, is a given item on that roadmap relevant for just one geography or all geographies, or one vertical or all verticals, or, and the sort of tags can be infinite. But if you think about visually, you're trying to save space, being able to tag a given item as being more or less relevant to a given area, is also something that I've seen as being quite useful.
Yeah, that's really good actually, and that's really relevant to slicing and dicing the content of your roadmap depending on that target audience. We might find that we've got area managers or domain managers, for example, that are interested in a specific geography and everything that affects that, and so tagging it for a geography makes complete sense for everything else. So we've not talked about that one, but I really like that, Michael. It's a great way of being able to just consolidate information, really small, but again, showing it in different ways, different lenses.
Well, I mean, if we connect that to to an experience that I've had some time ago, is our go-to-market organization was geographically aligned, right? So presenting something to the North American team that's like only UK related, that seems like something you haven't quite got your message to your audience right. So we would in maybe your product management tool or whatever the repository is that you're creating the key inputs, you're tagging things as this is UK, or this is North America, or this is global. So when you go to extract that information and put it into whatever the artifact is that you're going to present, you can say, we're just going to present like the UK version of the information, or the US version of the information, or the Australia version of the information. And so again, your audiences vary by as much as the roadmap content does.
Yeah, they absolutely do. And something that you mentioned there, which also feels important, is it's very much about reading the organization and the audience and creating the right roadmap for them. When we were talking about what you'd like to see on the roadmap in terms of the themes or couching some of those strategic imperatives that we've got, it really depends on what your company wants to see. That's why we don't have a one roadmap fits all for all of these companies, because it really depends on how the company is, the maturity of the company, the maturity of the products, what the stakeholders are used to seeing. I think some experiences have been where we want to introduce a roadmap and it's in such a different way than the organization thinks that actually the message never lands, because we need to transition them to understanding that roadmap as well. It's loads of stuff here that I think some things like tagging is going to help us along that journey.
Something you said I think it's really important, and maybe this is a caution, right? Is that like the roadmap you have today won't be the roadmap that you're presenting to the organization in 2 years or 3 years time, right? And because I think if you don't have a roadmap today and you start presenting one, like any good product, right, you're going to get loads and loads of feedback that you're going to have to filter through and say, okay, like what's valid, what's not valid, and how do I improve it? So I think about the artifact and the process, all that sort of stuff as a journey in and of itself. And you'll improve and you'll find new ways to do things, and you'll learn. Your organization will adopt some things better than others, and those things will become the sort of cultural norms for the way you do roadmaps at your company. And also not be too surprised when anytime you choose to change something, right, you're going to put yourself back into that cycle of people going, oh, like didn't look like that last time, or whatever. And so it will be iterative, and I think you should expect that sort of change to take place.
That's a great point, right? We should be product managing our road mapping process as well. Take that through the points that we would normally go through around experimentation and discovery and getting that feedback. I think that's vital. So I love that point. Maybe we finish up in terms of, do you have a pet hate to see on the roadmap? Something that you're just like, no, we shouldn't have that on there. Anything that comes to mind?
Can I say the fact that roadmaps have become a cultural sort of norm as a pet hate? The fact they exist at all. and maybe this is the point, right? Is that when the roadmap becomes the single focal point from stakeholder groups from which to engage with product. Like I think that is a sign that there's a bunch of other stuff that isn't going right in your product org. When you end up having conversations about, well, how do you prioritize? How do I get stuff on the roadmap? How one stakeholder or another needs to get more influence on the roadmap. Ultimately, I think when good product planning gets superseded with outsourcing product decisions or the roadmap to the masses. And I think, unfortunately, in many ways, like when I say the cultural norm of roadmaps, that's sort of what it's become, right? And so for product managers, for product leaders, a big part of establishing a roadmap in your organization is that education process. It is how product decisions are made, without inviting a whole bunch of, sort of unwanted, micro analysis. But I think that's part of the package. And so for me, that would probably be the pet hate, is this that the roadmap has just become this thing from which all product interactions happen. I don't think that's a wise. It leads to incrementalism. It leads to thrashing for teams. It disempowers product people. So yeah, that's probably the rant, I guess. But maybe you asked for it.
No, I totally agree, and I think we're looking for the experience of a real product people. I'm nodding along. It's not the be all and end all. I've heard terms like, "Oh, it's not in the roadmap for next year," or it's the roadmap's locked, or things like the roadmap is this sacrosanct document that can't be changed. And I think those attitudes need to change. And whilst we're on a channel called Talking Roadmaps, roadmaps and we enjoy them, they're not the be all and end all. And I think they need to sit alongside such an important plethora of other strategic documents, other downstream documents. And it's just one piece. And it's more of a process and a communication tool than what it looks like. If you've got a roadmap on the back of a napkin, that's probably fine too. So those are the important things here. I guess in terms of your experience, and I know that we've obviously got a major one, but are there any tools that you prefer to use for managing and visualizing roadmap?
I would say no preference, but I think I probably have landed on some go-tos, and probably not surprising. I think product management tools can be super helpful. They can help with planning. They can help make force the collection of key information from product managers. Those things that become the inputs, right, to the roadmap. They provide some structure. You can link them to engineering products like Jira or whatever, which is great. But they're mostly for other product teams, right? They're for product people and engineering people, maybe product marketing if you've got product marketers who are really in the mix with the product team, and maybe if you're lucky, the more technical teams like professional services, right? Like, but outside of that, I've getting in a previous role, we had a subscription to one of these product management tools, and we could see the logins, right? Everyone, like via Okta or whatever, could log in, and we could see the usage of non-product people. And so the traction outside of that was really small. So I think product management tools are useful. They have their place. I think they can help with planning and stuff, but they're not the place for a roadmap that is then consumed by your internal audiences. Where I've landed is you probably can't beat a set of PowerPoint slides or Google slides that you can turn into a PDF. And when I talked earlier about creating a roadmap for an internal audience and then presenting that roadmap, that's probably where I am, right? I'm thinking that you've taken this collection of insight either from docs or from a product management tool. I'm working and filtering the most important things with my spotlights and my headlines onto this slide or slides, and then I'm going to present that. The other thing that I think has become really important, at least it is important. I don't know. I think it's become probably a target state for me, I think is I do see a lot of value in a version of your roadmap that's online on your website, customer facing. I think I think it cuts through some of the noise. I think the sort of there's an overhead in all these audiences we talked about, right? There's an overhead in creating roadmaps for all these different departments. It's probably part of the reason that product operations was born as a concept. But I think your go-to-market roadmap, with your sales team, at least if you B2B software, let's say, and your customers can get pretty close. So I think if you can get to a place where online, you've got a version of a roadmap, presented really nicely, very simply, easily consumable, headline items, you can bring your go-to-market team and your customers sort of on the same page, right? And you can really easily communicate that. I still think you have those other options, right? Your Google Slides or whatever. But I think for me, that's maybe a bit of a utopia that I do see as being something that you can really gain leverage on. I think there's an opportunity there to have good discovery-based product conversations as you think about how you share roadmaps.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's nothing more flexible than PowerPoint or Google Slides or the Miros and Murals. There, you show explicitly what you want to do, what you want to show. Nothing else. It makes it very easy for you to filter, present it in the corporate way that you need to. I think there can sometimes be challenges trying to manage the roadmap behind that, but as a presentation tool, it gives us the biggest flexibility. So I think that's a great answer. I've got a couple of questions in terms of maybe some of the advice on road mapping. So are there anyone's advice out there on road mapping that you listen to or reference at all?
Yeah, probably a couple. I mean, I know you had Rich Mironov on recently. He's been a go-to for me for a long time, particularly because he's a B2B sort of enterprise software bend to what he's talking about. So I think Rich is great. Before we started recording, we talked about Marty Kagan. I think he's probably at the top of everyone's reading list. Certainly over the years, Intercom as a company have a great blog and podcast, which I've really enjoyed over the years. So yeah, there may be a few places that I go to.
Intercom's an interesting one, so that's one that I should check out, and I'll and our audience as well go and have a look at that, because seeing what other companies or just other product managers are doing as a guidance can often be really useful. You just look at it and go, I like what they're doing, and then we learn from that. Sometimes we learn things from all sorts of different places that we capture and take those as our own best practices.
For me, the point you've made there is the critical one, right? Which is if you're going to pick up Rich's view of the world or Marty's view of the world or the next person's view of the world and just stamp it on your org, again, that's probably not going to work either. Where I've got to over time, and I think my advice to others would be, fine, maybe that you do that, and that's a starting point. But I would say do broad reading and broad research and create a solution that works for you and your organization. So much goes into the melting pot that ends up in a roadmap, right? So focusing on product planning and getting that right. And then you mentioned this earlier, I think, but I don't think you can go past. You made a comment about product managing the roadmap, right? Or this artifact. And I think speaking to your audiences, right? Understanding what it is they think they need. What is it they think they want to see? What experiences they've had at previous organizations that have been good or bad, on a department by department sort of level, in this scenario, they're the customers of this particular thing. So I wouldn't go past, just talking to them and, blending then all of that information into something that works for you and then iterating over time.
Such a great point. Go and ask your audience what they want and then deliver it to them and then iterate it from there, right? Don't assume that we just build something and that's all they get. Michael, that's such a good point. I love that. So as we look to close out today's session, I've got a few more questions to ask you. So I'm curious, if you were to distill your philosophy of road mapping into a couple of sentences, how might you describe that? And that's often the most difficult question we ask.
I would say road mapping is the output and representation of good product planning. It's a communication tool that needs ownership, but it needs context.
Yeah, that's great, and it does capture a lot of the points as well. Talking about that context, the communication tool again, so important. It's often, there's things that we need to communicate on there, but really, if those things haven't landed, the roadmap hasn't done its job. So I love that. And is there anything about road mapping that I should have asked you that maybe I haven't? So any questions that I could have asked you, or some points that you'd like to kind of reiterate or make?
Maybe it was not necessarily a question that you didn't ask. We sort of touched on it briefly when we get into the product team communicates product roadmap to audience A. Let's just call it a sales team. Sales team then want to take that roadmap and communicate it to audience B, right? I.e., the customer. Should there be rules around distribution of roadmap? Might be a question that is worth asking. And on that, I guess a few points, maybe like having a disclaimer up the front of either internal or external presentation of a roadmap, i.e., we reserve the right to change our mind, is critical. If a roadmap does get sent to the customer, we need to pass with. Try to look at rules, and they're not hard and fast because it's hard to enforce some of these things, but like rules that say, if you're going to send a roadmap to a customer, ideally a PM or senior product person's copied on the email. If it's getting presented, i.e., you're going to take the roadmap and you're going to present it to a customer, well, like maybe a product person should be in the room, or even a product person should be actually doing the presentation. And like I said before, I think in those circumstances, the roadmap can become a point of leverage, a catalyst for good client discovery conversations that aren't just sales conversations. And I think some disclaimers and rules around distribution of roadmap, I would say, is probably a worthwhile thing to think about.
Yeah, that's a great point, and one that's one that I've sort of been reading a bit more about in terms of the boilerplate of what we put, or maybe things like expiry dates on there, just things that set expectations, because this can quickly come from an internal confidential document to something that can easily be shared, and if it doesn't go through those right rules, then we can cause more problems than we solve.
I made a point before about an online customer facing version of the roadmap, and I think there's a whole bunch of that sort of stuff to consider in there, right? You need to have those same protections in place. You got to think about competition as well in that scenario. Like there's other problems, but I do think that your points there are really important.
Based on your own points, Michael, but that's such an important thing, not falling into those common anti-patterns or bad practices that many new product managers or people that are creating roadmaps can fall into. That's perfect. So look, I wanted to give you an opportunity just to kind of share with our audience what it is that you that TrueLayer do. Is anything that you want to tell our audience about TrueLayer?
Quick elevator pitch, I suppose it would be remiss not to. So TrueLayer is an open banking payment platform, leveraging a sort of combination of recent regulation change and new technology that banks have enabled to reimagine the way the world pays, essentially. That includes everything from providing alternative payment methods to your debit card, to how the money actually settles with merchants, to a range of value-added services to help merchants streamline and improve the payment experience. So they're all the sort of types of problems and things we're working on at TrueLayer, and open banking certainly is becoming more prevalent as a payment method particularly across the UK and Europe.
Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to see you again, because obviously we've spoken in the past. I've really enjoyed what you've had to say. Just to close off then, so for our audience, if you've liked what Michael and I have said, please do give us a like down below, or drop a comment if something particularly resonated with you. Please do share this with people if you think something we've talked about would help them or really resonate with them. And if you'd like to sit where Michael is today and have a conversation with myself or my co-host Phil Hornby, drop a note down below or get in touch, and we'd love to speak with you. Otherwise, Michael Morris, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Have a great weekend.
Great. Thanks, Justin.